The headline is not sensationalism. It is the cold, hard economic truth gripping Russia. A comprehensive financial catastrophe is unfolding, driven by an inflation spike that has rendered the central bank's policies utterly impotent. The Russian economy is not just facing turbulence, it is staring down a systemic crisis that threatens to unravel the entire fabric of its military financing. This is FPV Explainer, where we break down the most fascinating stories in drone warfare. If you're enjoying this deep dive, hit the like button, subscribe, and drop a comment telling us what topic you want to see next. Your feedback shapes our future videos and keeps us bringing you clear, detailed analysis from the front lines. The latest figures are a public confession of failure. Weekly inflation has surged to an alarmingly high rate of 0.23%. This figure, which has not been seen since the severe economic distress of the spring, proves that the state has lost control over price stability. The central bank's previous claims that inflation was under control have been completely discredited. What was supposed to be a temporary post-hike inflation period has now transitioned into a persistent, malignant reality. The critical issue is that this price growth is not isolated to one sector. It is broad-based, affecting staple goods like vegetables and eggs, and most importantly, the fundamental cost of transport. This inflationary spike is a direct consequence of a failure to manage the money supply. The Russian economy is being overwhelmed by a massive, uncontrolled influx of cash. This influx stems from two primary, destructive sources: uncontrolled budget impulses and a new credit surge. The state is running a record deficit, and while the finance ministry is desperately trying to fill this hole with taxes, the bulk of the financing is effectively being monetized. Money is being pumped into the system to cover the state's military expenditures. This creates the very inflationary pressure the central bank is fighting. This budget-driven inflation is now colliding with an unprecedented financial threat: the collapse of the deposit market. In a stunning act of self-sabotage, Russian commercial banks have aggressively cut interest rates on savings deposits, with rates falling below 13%. This move, designed to reduce banks' expenditure, carries an existential risk. Analysts are warning that this low rate of return, combined with the rising, visible threat of inflation, will trigger a mass exodus of savings from the banking system, potentially releasing trillions of rubles in cash. This is a financial time bomb. If these savings are withdrawn and injected into the civilian economy, they will create an uncontrollable wave of demand-side inflation, accelerating the currency's decline and making the central bank's entire struggle against rising prices irrelevant. The financial sector is now operating in a state of political paralysis. The central bank is trapped in a profound contradiction. The logical anti-inflationary response would be to sharply raise the key interest rate. Yet the leadership is terrified of doing so, knowing that a massive rate hike would instantly choke off what little economic activity remains, kill the already struggling housing market, and make the cost of servicing the state's immense debt unmanageably high. They are caught between fighting inflation and triggering a full-scale industrial collapse. This economic shock is not merely a sign of distress. It is proof that the financial foundation of the Russian state is structurally unsound and facing a terminal crisis driven by political expediency.
We have identified the core financial instability, the crisis of inflation. But the most visible, politically damaging, and strategically significant symptom of this economic rot is the catastrophic fuel collapse. This is not a supply chain disruption. It is the deliberate, self-inflicted agony of a market that has been crippled by the war and is now collapsing under a combined assault of military strikes and government mismanagement. The evidence of this collapse is now unavoidable for every citizen in Russia. The price of gasoline on the retail market has climbed relentlessly, surpassing 10% growth since the beginning of the year, a rate that dwarfs the already high official inflation figures. But the price is only the secondary problem. The primary issue is physical scarcity. This scarcity is the direct, calculated result of Ukraine's kinetic sanctions campaign. Precision drone strikes have systematically targeted the most vital assets of the Russian oil industry, crippling key refineries. This has resulted in the loss between 8 and 14% of total processing capacity, a monumental and unsustainable blow to the nation's energy independence. The market is now suffering from a catastrophic physical deficit that is manifesting in a chaotic breakdown of the distribution system. This is where the government's attempt to manage the crisis has only amplified the disaster. The market has fractured, with a clear distinction emerging between large, state-aligned oil majors and the independent networks. The independent gas stations, which often serve remote areas and account for a significant portion of the retail market, are being systematically starved of supply. These operators are being forced to close their pumps because they simply cannot secure fuel. The reason is twofold: uncontrolled price growth and supply obstruction. The central bank's failure to contain inflation means wholesale prices are skyrocketing. Independent operators cannot purchase fuel at those high wholesale prices and still sell at a competitive retail rate, leading to massive losses and forced closure. More damningly, the industry is engaging in systemic market abuse. While the largest state-aligned oil companies are obligated to sell a portion of their fuel on the stock exchange to the independent sector, they are effectively sabotaging the deliveries. They prioritize funneling their limited supply to their own branded stations, leaving independent operators without product. This is a deliberate, cynical move that is driving thousands of small businesses into bankruptcy and concentrating power in the hands of the state-aligned energy giants. The most profound danger is that this crisis is not remaining local. The fuel shortage is a visible daily humiliation for the state, confirming that the war is coming home. Furthermore, the lack of supply is a direct threat to the military's small-scale logistics, which rely heavily on commercial-grade gasoline for drone generators and forward-area transport. This economic agony is the inescapable, brutal evidence that the financial resources of the Russian state are finite, and that the strategic decision to wage war is resulting in a fundamental, systemic failure of its most vital industrial sector. The agony of the market is the clearest sign that the current trajectory is unsustainable.
We have analyzed the core instability of surging inflation and the collapse of the fuel market. But the most terrifying and unpredictable threat facing the Kremlin's financial system is a ticking time bomb built into its own banking sector: the risk of a massive trillion-ruble outflow of deposits. This isn't external pressure, it is a profound internal weakness that threatens to trigger a catastrophic, self-sustaining financial crisis. The crisis is a direct, perverse consequence of the central bank's struggle to manage the war economy. In a desperate attempt to curb the economic slowdown and control their own borrowing costs, Russian commercial banks have aggressively cut interest rates on savings deposits. The rates on long-term deposits have plummeted to levels below 13%, reaching a historical low not seen since before the war-induced chaos. This move, designed to protect bank balance sheets, has created a fatal disincentive for the average Russian citizen to keep their savings in the bank. This brings us to the banking bomb. When citizens see their savings earning less than the official rate of inflation and far less than the actual price increases they experience daily on essentials like food and fuel, they rationally conclude that their money is safer outside the banking system. This situation is compounded by the visible signs of a failing economy: the long lines for gasoline, the rising cost of staples, and the general anxiety about the future. When confidence erodes, the first reaction of the populace is to pull their cash out. Analysts are warning of a potential mass exodus of deposits, a flight of up to 10 trillion rubles from the banking system. The financial domino effect of such an exodus would be catastrophic. The inflationary surge, the removal of trillions of rubles from deposits and its subsequent injection back into the consumer economy as citizens buy goods or assets to hedge against inflation, would create an uncontrolled surge in demand. This massive, sudden influx of cash would trigger a new, highly destructive wave of demand-side inflation, completely negating the central bank's attempts to stabilize prices and sending the ruble into a steep decline. Banking instability. While the major state-owned banks are currently profitable, they are facing mounting hidden liabilities. Reports indicate a dangerous concentration of credit risk among the top 10 banks, meaning their stability is tied to the health of just a few massive, potentially vulnerable corporate borrowers. Should the economy tip into a full recession, a move accelerated by the inflation and spending crisis, these major borrowers could default.
The simultaneous mass withdrawal of deposits, coupled with soaring non-performing loans, would immediately expose the structural weakness of the financial system, leading to a desperate scramble for capital and potentially necessitating massive, inflationary government bailouts. The Kremlin is trapped. To avoid this systemic collapse, the central bank needs to raise rates dramatically, but doing so would instantly choke the military's ability to service its debt and halt what little is left of the civilian economy. This trillion-ruble deposit crisis is a unique, self-inflicted wound that proves the fundamental unsustainability of the war economy. The attempt to manage both the war and financial stability is now guaranteed to fail, because the actions needed to solve one crisis, low rates to fund war debt, exacerbate the other, mass deposit outflow leading to hyperinflation. The system is now a volatile, self-destructive machine awaiting its inevitable breakdown.
We have analyzed the self-inflicted wounds of inflation and the banking system. Now, we confront the stark, non-negotiable reality of financial depletion. The state is running out of money to fund its own survival, leading to a profound collapse in critical civilian sectors. The cutting of resources is no longer a strategic option. It is a forced measure that exposes the total failure of economic governance and guarantees further social distress. The primary evidence of this strain is the record-breaking budget deficit. Despite desperate attempts to close the gap through bond sales and the aggressive increase of the key interest rate, the deficit has ballooned to nearly 4 trillion rubles over 9 months. The government is trapped in an agonizing paradox. It cannot lower the rate to stimulate the civilian economy because inflation is rampant, and it cannot raise it too high because the cost of servicing its existing debt becomes unmanageable. This financial paralysis means that the only way to sustain the military effort is to take money from other crucial sectors, triggering a systematic collapse in the civilian economy. This financial cannibalism is devastating the agricultural sector, the very industry that provides basic food security. The state has been forced to make deep, dangerous cuts to its own support programs. We are seeing a 25% reduction in the state program for agricultural support. This is not a sustainable cut. It is a direct attack on a sector that is already struggling. This financial hardship is compounded by immediate, unavoidable agricultural failures, the collapse of the animal husbandry sector, where cattle and swine populations are declining, and a catastrophic decline in sunflower harvest, a nearly 40% drop, which guarantees a surge in domestic food prices. The government's priority is war, and the price is food security. The lack of funds means that the government is actively undermining the supply of basic goods, ensuring that the food crisis will deepen in the coming year. The resource drain is now spreading like a contagion throughout heavy and specialized industries. The initial shock of sanctions and the exit of Western companies has transitioned into a full-scale industrial crisis. The auto industry, the Optavaz plant, once a symbol of domestic manufacturing, is reducing production by 40% and moving to a 4-day workweek. This is a clear indicator that the war economy cannot compensate for the collapse of civilian demand and the lack of vital imported components. The machinery sector. The agricultural machinery industry is anticipating a sharp decline in production as high interest rates and falling demand make it impossible for farmers to invest in new equipment. The banking sector risk. Even the financial sector, which is currently presenting positive profit figures, is sitting on a massive pool of toxic assets. The rapid economic slowdown means that banks must now increase their reserves against bad loans, a move that is a guaranteed reduction in profitability. The rise in credit risk concentration in major banks means that the failure of just a few large corporate clients could trigger a systemic banking crisis. The final verdict on this economic front is that the crises are no longer isolated. They are converging into a single terminal threat. The financial desperation of the Kremlin, its inability to solve the budget hole, and its choice to fund its military ambitions by actively destroying the civilian economy
are all factors that guarantee a deeper and prolonged crisis. The economic collapse is not just a statistical problem, it is a direct threat to the Russian state's ability to wage war. And the financial dead end they have reached is the clearest possible sign that the war is unsustainable.
We have meticulously analyzed the systemic failure of the Russian economy, the surging inflation, the banking fragility, and a collapse of key industrial sectors. Now we arrive at the final, unavoidable conclusion. These economic crises are not merely inconveniences. They are the decisive forces accelerating Russia's military defeat. The war is now unwinnable because the Kremlin has lost the financial capacity to sustain its aggression. The evidence is clear. All of Russia's internal contradictions are converging into a single terminal threat. The financial desperation of the leadership, forced to raise taxes to fill a gaping budget deficit, is proof that the old models of state control are failing. The war machine, which relies on a constant, massive flow of cash, is now being starved by its own financial mismanagement. This structural weakness is immediately being exploited by external pressure. The kinetic sanctions, the sustained, successful campaign against oil refineries, have created a fuel collapse that is strangling the military's small-scale logistics and creating a political crisis of unprecedented visibility. This is a brilliant strategic maneuver that turns an economic deficit into a direct military advantage for Ukraine. This terminal crisis is forcing the political leadership into a catastrophic choice. They are caught between fighting a war they cannot afford and implementing policies they are terrified of. The financial sector is a volatile time bomb. The threat of a trillion-ruble deposit outflow and the rapid decline in industry are making economic collapse a near certainty. The government cannot lower interest rates to stimulate the civilian economy because it risks hyperinflation. It cannot raise rates because it risks defaulting on debt. This paralysis ensures that the economic collapse will only accelerate, further starving the military effort and making the very idea of a long, protracted war impossible. The final verdict is sealed. The ultimate cause of Russia's defeat will be its unsustainable economy. The war is not being lost on the front lines alone, but in the banks, the refineries, and the factories. The leadership is losing its ability to provide the basic necessities: fuel, food stability, and a functioning financial system that guarantees social order. This erosion of control is a direct threat to the regime's stability, proving that the costs of aggression have reached an existential level. The combination of financial bankruptcy and the structural failure to adapt to modern economic warfare makes the continuation of the conflict impossible. The war is lost because Russia has run out of money and viable options.